Nestling in a picturesque river valley west of the town of Albert, a small village on the Somme gives us insight into life behind the lines. Here was a place where men were brought back from the front line wounded. So many never returned. What were their stories? What do we find outside the battlefield area? As I record this, it's the morning after a storm hit the north of England, and as I'm looking out my window, there's snow across the valley here in South Yorkshire, and the wind is raging against the window. So if you hear a bit more background noise than usual, that's what it is, the realities of the weather. And looking out across this landscape and seeing snow up on the high ground on the far side of the valley towards Wentworth, around the Hoover stand, the old folly that sits close to the village of Wentworth where the big house was, I look at that landscape, and a landscape that I've walked during the lockdown period this last nearly 2 years now, that has reminded me so much of walking the ground on the Western Front, and it takes my mind back to snow on the battlefield, snow on the Somme. There's not snow on the Somme at the moment, but there could be next week, and once more I'm heading back to the front, and I'll be on the Somme. Not this time with a group, but with my old school pal Andrew Whittington, and we plan a few days around the northern sector of the Somme and up on northern France on the Forgotten Front, and who knows what we'll find along the way, both in terms of weather and the history of the Great War. We had another one of our supporters evenings on Zoom last night, and it was good to see so many of you again, and good to hear your stories and your comments and your questions. This is something that we do on a regular basis for those of you who are very kind enough to support the podcast via Buy Me a Coffee and Patreon, and I put links on those platforms, and we have one of these meetings once a month where we can have a get-together and feel like we are some kind of old frontline community, and I want you to be involved in that as much as me just talking to you. And the next one will hopefully have a guest talking about a particular aspect of the Somme battlefields. But this week we're on the Somme. We've returned to the Somme once more. We're never, as I've said before, we're never very far from those fields of the Somme. But we're not in the battlefield area again. We're behind the lines. And I think the behind the lines area is an important one, and one that we will continue to return to. So we're heading off with our boots to the village of Heilly, just behind the lines close to the town of Albert, for a look at that part of the battlefields of the Somme. So where are we this week? We're in the village of Heilly. This is just west of the town of Albert, just south of the D929, which is the road between Albert and Amiens. It sits in a valley, the valley of the river Ancre, the Anchor. Now, we most associate that with the battlefield area around places like Hamel and Grandcourt and Beaucourt, but it ran down through Albert and into this area as well. So the Ancre was an important river in many respects. The fighting all around the 1916 sector was in many ways the Battle of the Ancre more than the Battle of the Somme, because the Somme River was much further away. The village of Heilly is only a small village. It sat close to the front line in 1918 when the Germans broke through and captured Albert on the 27th of March that year. But for most of the war, it was behind the lines. It was behind first the French front in this area, and then the British front when British troops began to take over the sector around Albert in 1915. So when the French held the Somme sector in those early months of the war, following the advance across northern France by the German army en route to Paris, there was fighting around Albert between French and German forces. A line was established. Both sides dug in that autumn of 1914, and the sector of the Somme developed. There were some small-scale actions involving the French trying to attack the German positions in 1915, but that was on a much smaller scale than some of the battles elsewhere on the Western Front that year. The British then began to arrive in that summer of 1915, about a year before the Battle of the Somme, and villages like Heilly, quite close to Albert, would have seen their first British troops at that stage. Now, villages like Heilly, right up until the Battle of the Somme, and probably right through it, the vast majority of the villagers who had lived there before the war were still there. It was close to the battlefield area, but it wasn't evacuated in the way that some villages that were almost on top of the battlefield area were. We didn't have the right to ask the French to leave in villages like this, so we had to negotiate the movement of a populace from an area. And one of the principal reasons for the movement of them was gas, the development of gas as a weapon in 1915 and its usage on the battlefields meant that the civilian population, unless they too were issued with gas masks, were often under threat. But in villages like Heilly, there was an impetus for people to stay behind. They didn't want to leave their houses, for one, or their farms, or the land in which they worked, and they were all able to do that despite the presence of increasingly large numbers of British soldiers. But also the arrival of these soldiers created a market, men with money in their pockets and a willingness to spend it. So what could they do? Now, there were lots of little buildings in places like Heilly that could open as cafes or estaminets, places where you could get both food and drink. And when you look at the buildings in the main streets here, and we're standing in the Rue St. Anne, and I'll put a map on the podcast website, oldfrontline.co.uk, so you can see where we're walking this week. But we're standing in that main street, the Rue St. Anne, and because Heilly was only close to the front in those final months of the Great War, the vast majority of buildings in villages like this are the original. So these are buildings which the British soldiers and Commonwealth soldiers who arrived here later would have known during those months of the Battle of the Somme in 1916. And when we look at them, we can see there's quite a few that either were cafes or could easily have become cafes. So that was a common thing as well. And in many of these villages, at least one person set up some kind of photographic studio. And although I don't know of a specific one in this village, many of them are not recorded. It's only when you come across images where soldiers have written the name of the place where it was taken on the back of it that you realise some kind of photographic studio existed in that area. The most famous one in this area of the Somme was not that far away at Vignecourt, where a French veteran who'd been wounded and discharged from the army set up a studio in the courtyard of his house in some of the outbuildings and created this massive archive of images which is now preserved in Australia, but there's a museum of it there which is well worth a look at, and we'll hopefully do a podcast on the story of that and that collection further down the line. But that's a little bit further away behind the lines, just up the road at Warloy-Ballon. I know there was another photographic studio there. Dominic Zanardi, who many of you know, the proprietor of the Tommy Bar at Pozieres, has a collection of glass negatives taken in that village, some of which he's printed and put on the walls of his cafe. So that aspect of life behind the lines in villages like this was an important one, because it was a moment where British and Commonwealth soldiers could pause and record themselves on those battlefields on the Western Front by having their photograph taken and put onto postcard. And those postcards are really all part, in my mind, of the archaeology of the Great War. It's not just about exhuming the remains of soldiers from battlefields or excavating old trenches. The photographs are part of that archaeology as well, because they give us an insight into really how men looked while they were on active service. In my own collection, I've got thousands of images of soldiers that were taken in Britain before they went to the Western Front. Very smart uniforms, everything in the correct place, worn in the correct way, and then you compare those to active service photos and you see a very different sort of soldier, and also the look very often on their faces as well. The strain of war, the strain of active service, it often shows in the type of images that you see taken behind the lines in villages like this. So in 1916, the village of Heilly was just a few miles behind the front. There were German guns that could reach this far, and I'm sure that the odd shell fell here. But most of the time, this was not in any kind of direct observation from the Germans. There would have been aircraft coming over, and there would have been German observation balloons on the far side of Albert that may well have spotted the movement of troops in this area, but it wasn't shelled anything like the villages that were much closer to Albert itself. And what that meant was it was used extensively for the billeting of troops because it was considered a safe area. So when a unit was up the line, it would do a stint in the trenches and then come back to a village like this for a few days before going back up the line again. And that's why these places behind the lines are so important to the experience of British and Commonwealth soldiers, and on the other side of no man's land, equally as important to the experience of German soldiers as compared to the actual battlefields, because very often, certainly in the case of British and Commonwealth soldiers, they only spent a minority of their time in the very forward area of the battlefield. They got to know places like this, particularly if they stayed on fronts like this for some months in, for example, the lead up to the Battle of the Somme. So if you were a unit like the 51st Highland Division, who arrived on the Somme in August 1915 and were here in the approaching months to the battle, you would have rotated through villages like this on a regular basis and perhaps even acquired your own favourite estaminet that you used to visit when you were out of the trenches. And because these places were places that soldiers connected to a good, positive experience, singing, drinking, eating, meeting French mademoiselles, talking to local population, going out on long walks. And when you read soldiers' diaries, you see they were given time off between parades in places like this, and they would often venture off out into the countryside to go and see a nice area of woodland, to watch some birds in the fields, and do the kind of things that they did in nature back in civilian life before the war. So villages like Heilly were very much like an oasis for these soldiers out of the line, and interviewing the veterans back in the 80s and 90s, they would often talk about a village not on the battlefield, not in the line of their advance, not where they lost their mates, but a village behind the front, northern France or somewhere near Popperinge or here on the Somme, that they had spent some time in at one period of their war service, and it meant something to them. So when we come here and we're walking in their world of 1916 when we come to villages like this, because the village of Heilly, if you look at it on Street View, it is really barely changed in over 100 years with all these original buildings here. We're almost transported back, and if you could bring a veteran who was here in 1915 or 16 back to Heilly today, they would recognise the buildings just as they would have done more than a century ago. So there is that kind of continuation in places like this, a connection to the past, which I think is what makes them quite important and quite potent in terms of visiting them on a trip to the battlefields. It's not all about going, as I've said before, to the big memorial sites and the preserved trenches and the museums. Come to places like this too, because there's a lot to be gained from it. As we walk down the Rue Sainte-Anne in a westward direction, so away from Albert and round to the far side of the village, we come up to the village church in Heilly with the war memorial in front, and we find these in every French village. This one has quite a sizable number of names on it for a small village like this, and again it's always a good thing to stop at these memorials because it gives us an insight into the scale of French losses in the First World War. As I've no doubt said on this podcast before, if you look at France and Britain in 1914, France is a much bigger country, something like 2.5 times the size of Britain, but its population was, I think, marginally smaller than Britain's population in 1914. But at the end of the war, Britain, excluding what was then the Empire, had lost about 750,000 dead. France had lost 1.4 million. So this is a considerable loss to a nation like France, and something that we see reflected in the long lists of names on war memorials like this. And just like war memorials in Britain, they come in all sorts of shapes and sizes with all sorts of designs. And I find it fascinating going around these villages to stop and pause and look at these French war memorials, because there is some really fascinating and intriguing architecture involved in the construction of them. The one here at Heilly is a fairly simple one, but sobering at the same time when you look at those names. From the war memorial, from the heart of the village, we'll follow the road round the D52, effectively south out of the village and close to the river Onc. As we mentioned earlier, this is a river that we would more closely associate with the actual battle area, but here in these villages west of Albert, it ran not in an area of fighting, but in an area of safety. And what you see with units out of the line here is men going to bathe in the River Onc. This is mentioned in quite a lot of war diaries and in personal accounts of men who went through these villages. And when you can stand on a little bridge and look down into the Onc and the valley here, you picture thousands of Tommies there in the heat of the summer of 1916, filthy and dirty from their time in the trenches, probably covered in body lice, and this was a great release for them to throw off their clothing, get rid of their webbing gear or their leather kit, and just jump in this river and have a swim. So it's a place, again, that soldiers connected a positive experience to, and I think this is why villages like this meant so much to them. We'll stay on the road going out of the village, and it takes us towards the main railway line, the railway line that in this area runs from Albert and then northwards to Lille, and then from Albert through here towards the city of Amiens. And just on the other side of the railway line at the crossing is Heilly Station, and that'll be our next stop. When we stand here today, we see that Heilly railway station is only a small station, but it's on a major line, and it's a station that is still in use, a still active station, and you can get regular trains to here from Albert or Amiens, and from here to those places and indeed beyond. And I've mentioned a few times on the podcast, it really is worth doing at least once in your visits to the Western Front. Get on a train and follow the tracks around places like this, because it does give you a very different perspective. And railways, of course, were so important in the story of the Great War. A.J.P. Taylor used the phrase war by timetable. Now, that was to describe the earlier period of the war with the mobilisation of great armies with the use of railways. But as the war went on, trains became more and more important in the infrastructure behind the battlefields to supply, to bring up men and evacuate the wounded. And that's all part of the story of the trains in villages like this behind the lines on the Somme. In 1916, this was a small brick-built railway station. I've seen some postcards of this, and it looks to be a brick structure rather than the concrete-y structure that we see now. This could well be an interwar replacement of the original building, which may have been damaged in the Great War, or even a post-Second World War replacement of it. But despite its small size, both then and now, it was in an important location, and we can see why when we look around the wider area of the railway station. Now, this is a fairly flat area set between the valley of the River Onque and the high ground above the Somme beyond. If we look towards the cemetery, which we can now see further down this road, the ground rises beyond it to a high point, and beyond that was the valley of the River Somme itself. And what this meant was this flat area sat in a bit of a bowl between two geographical features, sheltered from German observation. Now, not from the air, as we've already said, but certainly from direct observation. So when they began to look at the infrastructure, when the British Army took over the Somme sector, and as we know from previous podcasts, what the British Army did from the very beginning of the war, which was one of those paths to victory, what they did was develop and increase the infrastructure year on year as the war went forward. And by this, I mean the provision of the ability to resupply yourself, both in terms of ammunition, equipment, men, fuel, water, food, everything else, and also the evacuation of wounded away from the battlefield. And this big wheel of war that kept turning could only keep turning by investing in this infrastructure, which the British did on a big scale. And the Railway Operating Division of the Royal Engineers was an important part of that infrastructure, providing the trains that resupplied the army and moved it around. And while on the battlefield they would lay down temporary railway systems using light railway tracking and small-scale engines, this was a main railway line where full-size steam engines could operate, and the Railway Operating Division could then utilise a place like this and utilise track like this to move their trains back and forth. And also, in a location like this, which offers this big flat plain, you can build a siding, so trains can be taken off the main track, pulled into a siding, and men can be unloaded there to march up to the front. And also the ground here was suitable for the establishment and the building of casualty clearing stations. Now, these were the first main medical unit that a soldier would be brought to from the battlefield. It'd be picked up by stretcher bearers, taken to a regimental aid post, receive treatment for his wounds there, have the wound dressed, and then taken to a dressing station, either an advanced dressing station or a main dressing station, where the Royal Army Medical Corps would be, where they would clean and redress his wounds, assess his survivability, put him into an ambulance, and then bring him back to a proper medical facility like a casualty clearing station. And a CCS, a casualty clearing station, occupied about a square mile of ground. There were not just medical officers here, but surgeons. As the war moved forward, there was blood transfusion, X-ray facilities. There were nurses in places like this. So this is a point which women would have got close to the battlefield. Albert and the front lines only a few miles down the valley, so we can see how close some women were to the actual fighting itself. And one of the first established here was the 36th Casualty Clearing Station, which opened in the spring of 1916 in the lead-up to the Battle of the Somme, when they began to put in infrastructure like this for the treatment of wounded in preparation for the forthcoming offensive, because it was expected that there would be casualties, and the way to deal with those casualties was to create the facility for them to be treated and managed, and the CCS was an important part in the link in that type of chain, from the battlefield to a casualty clearing station to the base hospitals further back. And the provision of a railway line close by made that even more efficient, because the wounded might be brought to the casualty clearing station by horse-drawn or motorised ambulances, but once they were treated here and reassessed and then required further treatment in those main hospitals at places up on the coast or at Rouen. Rouen was used in particular in 1916 for the treatment of wounded, as the big Saint-Sever cemetery there testifies to, with a large number of men who died of their wounds. This line could then be used, so one of the sidings was for hospital trains, for the wounded to be loaded up onto a hospital train, and on board that were medical officers, nurses, medical orderlies, who would look after the wounded in the transition between the casualty clearing station and a base hospital further back. So they would move from the siding onto the main track, head down the valley towards Amiens, and there is a main route, railway route, between Amiens and Rouen, for example, or from Amiens to Abbeville, another coastal hospital area where there were hospitals, and they could move from there further up to northern France as well. So it was a good link between the reception of wounded from the battlefield and the evacuation of those wounded further back to the key points miles behind the lines, where they could be treated in big medical facilities, big hospitals that were up on the coast or in towns and cities right away from the fighting itself. Now that meant, as an ordinary soldier with a wound received on the battlefield like the Somme, whether that was in the quiet period in the lead up to the battle or in the battle itself, your chances of surviving it with this quite complex arrangement for the treatment and movement of wounded was quite high. But there was no antibiotics, there was no way of stemming infection, and infection within wounds caused by the conditions on the battlefield was one of the great killers in the Great War. So whenever there is this type of medical facility placed in a location like this, not far away, there will be some kind of military cemetery, and that's what we're going to walk to further along in the walk itself, to the Heilly Station Cemetery. So when we stand here close to the railway station and we look across the flat open fields where the casualty clearing stations were located, and it wasn't just the 36th CCS that was here, but there were a number of them as the battle moved forward, but using them as an example because we got some records of the numbers and scale of the treatment that they did in 1916. What we see when we look at the casualties coming into this casualty clearing station at the beginning of the Battle of the Somme, they're coming from a specific part of the battlefield. So not the whole front from Gommecourt down to Montauban. What the army did was to split the front up into sectors from a medical treatment point of view and evacuate them down towards given facilities in those areas, so that one facility didn't get overwhelmed by a huge number of casualties coming from a wide front. And again, this was all part of the complex arrangements for the treatment of the wounded. And you can map these out in the different sectors: frontline area to the site of the nearest dressing station, to the site of the nearest close proximity casualty clearing station, which is often close to another railway system like this one. So there's a lot of logic in it, really. So in this area, the men coming here at the beginning of the Battle of the Somme were from the sector between La Boisselle and Montauban. So these were men in the fighting for Mash Valley and Sausage Valley, the attack on Fricourt, the advance on Mametz, and the POWs battalions from Manchester and Liverpool, for example, who advanced up into Montauban on the 1st of July. But as that part of the front began to move forward, so in the La Boisselle sector towards Contal-Maison, Fricourt, up towards Mametz Wood and beyond Bazentin and beyond High Wood, and then in the southern sector, the Battle of the Horseshoe of the Woods with Bernafay Wood, Trones Wood, the advance towards Guillemont, Delville Wood, Longueval and so on. The casualties from that area came here. So we can see a progression and a logic to the types of units that we then see reflected in the burials in the nearby cemetery. And to give you an idea of scale, on the first day of the Battle of the Somme, over 1,000 men were brought into the 36 casualty clearing station from that sector. Now that's not the total number of wounded, because again they would not have sent them all to this one CCS. There would have been another one that some of them were sent to as well if this was being overwhelmed. And then on the 2nd of July, over 1,500 men were admitted here. And then in a period from about the 3rd to the 7th of July, so as the fighting begins to move forward towards Contal-Maison, the early advance on Mametz Wood, the push towards Trones Wood, over 3,000 men were admitted during that period. So that's, over 5,500, nearly 6,000 men in the first week of the Battle of the Somme in one casualty clearing station. And you can see how busy these places would have been, and you can begin to imagine the kind of things that they saw with the casualties that were coming in, all types of wounds. For some of them, probably wounds that they'd never seen before because of the scale of the battle, the industrial scale of the killing and the wounding and the advance on the Somme in 1916. And quite a few famous names are connected with this area. One of those that was brought into this casualty clearing station with wounds received in the fighting in the advance towards High Wood was Robert Graves. We told his story in a previous podcast episode where we looked at some books connected with the village of Bazentin. And Graves was wounded taking his men forward into the advance on High Wood, brought back to Bazentin and lay on a stretcher next to the civil cemetery when a shell struck one of the tombstones there, and he was wounded by bits of fragment from the headstone, and then evacuated down through Death Valley near Mametz Wood, and the medical officer thought he died of his wounds, and that's when a report went forward to say that Lieutenant Robert Graves had died of his wounds. That went to his family. They published an obituary in the Times newspaper. His great friend Siegfried Sassoon read that obituary and wrote a poem in memory of Robert Graves. But Graves got to the casualty clearing station here, and he was far from dead, and eventually came round and was able to send messages to confirm that he hadn't died of his wounds and that he was still very much in the land of the living. And Graves gives a very good account of this in his book Goodbye to All That, a classic officer's memoir of the Great War. I think Sassoon called it the greatest work of fiction on the Great War, but nevertheless, I think it gives us quite a good insight into Graves himself as well as the experience of an infantry officer on the battlefields. So as the fighting moved on beyond July into August, you see that southern sector of the Somme, the fighting revolving around the woods with High Wood and Delville Wood, and the fighting towards Guillemont, Ginchy. Once the Guards arrive, for example, then the 16th Irish Division in the fighting there. You see the casualties coming back from those sectors reflected in the admissions to this. And this would have been an area of much activity in 1916. And as the battle began to move to a conclusion and the weather changed, the rains came, mud everywhere on the Somme. It was an absolute quagmire of mud and sub-zero temperatures as the months moved on towards the winter with that terribly cold winter of 1916-17. The type of admissions coming in here would have changed from battle casualties, gunshot wounds, shrapnel wounds and things like that to men being admitted for treatment because of the elements, so cold weather conditions, frostbite, trench foot and just general illness. We know now how we can get ill when the weather changes, and the generation of the Great War was a tough generation, but we have to remember that they were living in open ditches in the fields when it was minus 20, and even the toughest of men can break down under those conditions, and break down they did. So the staff, the nurses and the doctors and the medical orderlies who worked in places like this would have seen such a range of casualties, such a range of conditions come in to a medical unit such as this, and would have seen the full tragedy and the full experience, really, of the Great War in microcosm through the men who passed through their hands, most of whom, thankfully, would have survived. But as we'll see, as we walk to the next part of our walk, not every man came home. And we're heading now for Heilly Station Cemetery. As we walk down the track to Heilly Station Cemetery, we can see that it's quite a large one. It sits just below the base of a hill with rising ground behind it, leading, as I mentioned before, up to the ridgeline that overlooks the valley of the River Somme. Up over the top of that ridge in April 1918, Baron von Richthofen was shot down there in his final flights of the Great War. But Heilly Station Cemetery is a Lutyens cemetery. It was designed by Edwin Lutyens, one of the principal architects of the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, and it's got quite a few unusual design aspects to it. As we come into the gateway, there's a long corridor, and on the walls of the corridor there are cap badges of units represented in the burials within the cemetery. Now, this is unique in Commonwealth cemeteries on the Western Front, because on a usual standard headstone, the cap badge is recorded there, so there's no need to put such badges on a wall like this. But this was a cemetery established close to the location of all these medical units, and what they would do as part of their preparations for big attacks, for offensives like the Somme, was to create a burial ground where they would dig trenches. Now, not mass graves, each man would be buried individually, but the dead would be brought to those trenches and buried side by side, and very quickly they would fill up because of the number of men who would sadly die of their wounds. And that meant that the burial areas were quite compact, and when it came to replacing the wooden crosses, and I've seen some wartime photographs of this, the crosses seem to be staggered, so it looks as if there's one front, one back, one front, one back, to maximise the number of grave markers in a particular area. When it came to replacing those with headstones, it meant that multiple names had to be put on the headstones, and there was no room for cap badges. Now, this is not universal throughout the cemetery, but there are some areas, particularly connected with key moments during the 1916 battle, where you see this in different parts of the cemetery. So with no room for cap badges on the headstones, Lutyens, I presume, made a decision to place the badges on the wall instead. So it makes quite an interesting little walk to go down this corridor with its archways, where you can look out into the graves and see the different cap badges of the regiments that are represented amongst the dead within this silent city. And I'll put a photograph of this up so you can see what I'm talking about. In total, there are 2,973 burials here. Of these, 2,345 are British, 401 are Australian, 118 New Zealand. There are 73 Germans buried here, and I'll come back to that, 14 Canadians, 12 unknown British, and 10 unknown Germans. Now, when you come to a cemetery like this and you see German burials, it does surprise people. Why are there Germans buried in a British cemetery? Now, as a medical evacuation area, it wouldn't just be British and Commonwealth, British and Empire wounded that would be coming back. We would pick up German wounded prisoners as part of the fighting, and we treated them with as much respect, as much dignity, and we treated their wounds in the same way that we did with our own troops. So German soldiers would have been brought back to casualty clearing stations like 36 CCS, for example, and would have been treated there, normally in separate wards, because soldiers are soldiers. They've just been fighting the enemy. Their duty is to attack and kill and destroy the enemy. And if you try and, they're not going to suddenly wake up and say, oh, we're friends now. So there was a bit of antagonism between frontline soldiers and German prisoners. Now, that was understandable in the conditions of the battlefield. So generally, German wounded were treated separately, not in the beds alongside British Tommies. So just like British soldiers coming back with infected wounds, exactly the same thing, sadly, could happen to German soldiers. So German soldiers, when they died of their wounds in the casualty clearing station, were brought here for burial in a separate plot. And you can see those quite clearly in the layout of the cemetery when you come here. But again, they were buried with the same sort of dignity and respect. and very often there would have been chaplains. If the soldier was identified as Jewish, I'm sure that a Jewish chaplain would have come along for the burial service, and a notification was then given via the Red Cross to say that that soldier had died of his wounds and that he was buried in this cemetery. Now, post-war, in some cemeteries, all the German burials were then removed and taken to German burial sites like Fricourt or the Mandevillers on the Somme. In others, they weren't. And I've no idea why some cemeteries had the German dead removed and some didn't. But here at Heilly Station Cemetery, as far as I'm aware, this represents the scale of the German soldiers that were once buried here. I don't think any have been removed, to my knowledge. But if anyone's done any research on this and can shed some more light on it, it would be greatly received. Now, only a dozen of the nearly 3,000 British and Commonwealth burials in here are unknown. Now, this is common in behind-the-line cemeteries close to medical facilities, because these men are coming in with their pay books in their pockets, their dog tags around their neck, and other papers that prove who they were. So the chances of an unknown soldier being brought in and treated, and then if he dies, they don't know who he is pretty slim. Now, there are conditions in which that can happen, possibly relating to the nature and type of wound that the soldier had. And we won't dwell on that too deeply, but if I mention flamethrowers or the power of high explosive, I think you'll know what I'm talking about. So what it meant was that the vast majority of men in places like this were buried as identified soldiers. So that means in a cemetery like Heilly, it's an important cemetery because it gives us a good cross-section of the sort of men that came to the Somme front, fought in the Somme front, their backgrounds, their stories, and there are so many stories in here, thousands of them, so where to begin? Now, we can't talk about every single soldier, but there are a few that people go to in cemeteries like this to look at, to get some idea. And one of the things I always try and highlight when you come to a cemetery like this is, aside from the ordinary soldiers who we can see in great ranks amongst the dead, there are senior officers as well. The old saying, generals die in bed, is a much beloved saying by frontline soldiers, thinking that they're the ones, as a member of the PBI, the Poor Bloody Infantry, doing the fighting, but senior officers died as well. And we've got two contrasting stories here for how these men came to be casualties. One of them, as you come into the cemetery, there's a plot of Australian graves, and Brigadier General Duncan John Glassford is buried there. He was the commanding officer of the 12th Australian Infantry Brigade, part of the 4th Australian Division, and he died of his wounds on the 12th of November 1916, aged 43. He was originally from Scotland. He was the son of a Major General, and he'd served with the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders and had fought in the Boer War and in Somaliland. In 1914, he was out in Australia as the Director of Military Training, and on the outbreak of war, he joined the Australian Imperial Force. He went to Gallipoli with the original Anzacs in 1915, and then was given command of an infantry brigade. That brigade, as part of the 4th Australian Division, in November 1916, as the Battle of the Somme was coming to an end, they were holding the line just north of Flers, so close to Les Sars and across in front of Flers near Factory Corner and over towards the high ground on the Le Transloy Ridge near Gurdecourt. Big open expanse, devoid of cover, lots of casualties there from shell fire, and then the winter period, lots of casualties from the terrible conditions as well. But Brigadier General Glassford was up there inspecting the trenches on the 12th of November 1916, and he was wounded by a shell burst somewhere in a sunken lane near Gurdecourt. It took him 10 hours to be evacuated to the casualty clearance station, and what this gives us an insight into is how tricky the evacuation of wounded could be on a battlefield that was smashed to bits by shellfire, which by November 1916 the Somme very much was. It was the same up in Ypres. Once Passchendaele was captured at the end of 1917, it was taking 18.5 hours for men to move up, and logically 18.5 hours for men to move back, including the wounded. And if it took 10 hours to get this senior officer back to a casualty clearance station behind Albert in November 1916, we can see that the lines of communication on the Somme were as much disrupted by the conditions as they were on other battlefields of the Great War. So he died of his wounds here, one of a large number of brigade commanders or even divisional commanders to become battle casualties on the battlefields of the Great War. But also buried here is another Brigadier General Archie Stuart Buckle. He was born in India in 1868. His family was from Surrey, however. He was educated at Clifton College and then at the RMA Woolwich, and he entered the Royal Artillery as a gunner officer. He served with them in India and South Africa and the Sudan, and when war broke out, he was in India with the 19th Battery, part of the Indian Corps. They were mobilised to come to Europe, sailed to Marseille, and then moved up to the front line in the autumn of 1914, and he served with them in some of the early battles that Indian troops were involved in places like Neuve Chapelle and the First Battle of Ypres. He later went on to command a Royal Field Artillery Brigade with 18-pounder guns, and then in 1916 he was appointed to become the Commander Royal Artillery of the 17th Northern Division and rose to the rank of Brigadier General. Now, a CRA, a Commander Royal Artillery, was the chief gunner of an infantry division. A division comprised about 20,000 men, 12 infantry battalions, and all the support troops, including Royal Field Artillery units with field guns, 18-pounders, and in some cases 4.5-inch howitzers as well. And the chief gunner, the CRA's job, was to direct the artillery effectively on the battlefield, to assist a division in its attack or to defend a division when it was holding part of the front line. And this could not be done by sitting just in a chateau behind the line. So quite a few CRAs, Commander Royal Artilleries, were killed during the Great War, going up to inspect the battlefield and see what was the best positions for the guns and where observation posts should be sited and the lines of communication to link the OPs, the observation posts, with the gun sites. But that's not how Brigadier General Buckle died. We sometimes think that with the war going on, people didn't die of ordinary things, but they did. So he was admitted to the 38th Casualty Clearing Station at Heilly with meningitis, and he died of this on the 18th of August 1916, aged 47. So he wasn't a battle casualty, but he was a casualty nevertheless. Men got sick on active service. The conditions of active service, particularly with senior officers, often wore them down, and their vulnerability to disease and sickness probably increased as a consequence of that. So he is not a battlefield casualty, but yet is one of the many senior officers to have died in the war. So two contrasting stories with those brigadier generals. Now, not far from Brigadier General Glassford's grave is an unusual grave marker, a non-standard headstone, and this is a column with a cross on the top. And I'll put a picture on the podcast website, oldfrontline.co.uk, for you to have a look at this. It commemorates an ordinary soldier, not an officer, not a senior officer, an ordinary soldier, a digger, John Patrick O'Neill of the 13th Battalion Australian Imperial Force, who died on the 6th of January 1917, aged 21. He was from West Maitland in New South Wales. He died of accidental injuries while doing bombing training. Now, he was a bomber, so he was a soldier that operated with the battalion bombing officer with grenades, hand grenades, Mills grenades, to take on German positions in combat, take out dugouts, attack trench positions and defensive points. And this involved a lot of training with the grenades, and when you read about this training, there wasn't a lot of health and safety, and some men sadly were injured and killed during this type of training, where a pin was pulled out of a grenade, the grenade either accidentally exploded or the men weren't entirely sure what they were meant to do with the grenade and didn't throw it quick enough, and it either exploded in the air above them or they went to throw it and the grenade came out of their hand and landed behind them. All of these kind of things you can read about in accounts of bombing accidents in the Great War. So it was during one of those that he died, but he was obviously a much beloved member of his unit, which is why this monument was placed on the grave not after the war but during the war. And it's one of a number of graves like this with a similar kind of design memorial on it that you see in some cemeteries in this area, all of Australian soldiers. So this makes you wonder, did they go to a stonemason in one of these villages in the Ancre Valley west of Albert who specialised in this type of grave and said to him, we want you to put this on our mate's grave? And you see it here and you see it in a couple of other locations as well. Now, strictly speaking, it should have been removed after the war and replaced with a normal headstone, but it's of such high quality and it's lasted more than a century, 105 years nearly now, that it remains and probably will continue to remain. But the Commission's policy with these is if they ever deteriorate, they can remove them and replace them with a normal headstone. The graves in here are to a degree in chronological order, so you can follow the path of the Battle of the Somme as you walk through the cemeteries and walk along the rows. So you can go to September 1916, for example, and see a large number of men from the London territorial battalions who were involved in the fighting at High Wood. This was one of the first reasons that I came to visit this cemetery, because I picked up some medals and a memorial plaque to some of the London lads who were buried here, who died of their wounds from the fighting at High Wood and later at Eaucourt as they pushed beyond the wood itself. But there's a story of a grave in here that's quite extraordinary, and I came across this story when I was living on the Somme, and the gentleman who told me the story contacted me to ask me to go and visit a grave in here. Now, I'm not going to mention his name or even the name of the casualty to respect his privacy, and I'm never entirely sure what to make of this story, if I'm honest with you, and I'm not going to tell you. You can make up your own mind. Anyway, this gentleman, who is American, who lives in the heart of America, when he was a young man in the 60s, 70s, he went to a local fair where there was a little tent with an old lady who would read your palm, read your future for you. So he was dared by his mates to go and do this, and he walked into the tent and he sat down, and the lady looked at him transfixed, grabbed his hand and said, "You are," and gave him the name, rank and regiment and date of death of an officer killed in the Battle of the Somme. Now, he'd never heard of the Battle of the Somme at that point and was kind of freaked out by this, as you can imagine, and buried it for a long time in his back of his mind and tried to forget about it, but it kept coming back to him and he kept remembering the name and it wouldn't go away. And then many years later, he began to read about the First World War, hoping he might come across this person's name, but he never did. And then he joined the Western Front Association and he made some inquiries, and he discovered that this officer was a real person and that he was killed, died of wounds in the Battle of the Somme, and was buried at Heilly Station Cemetery. So he could never really figure out why this lady had said this to him, how she'd said it, what that meant. Who knows what it means? But he obviously began to wonder, was he a reincarnation of a soldier who had died in the Great War? I've come across this quite a lot with people passionate about the Great War. My old friend John Dray often speculated on this. Were we somehow reincarnations of old souls that had been through this war? Did that explain why we were so interested in it? I don't know. I don't have the answers to that, but it makes interesting speculation. And this gentleman who I know has never come to this grave. He had an opportunity to do so, but he never came here, and perhaps he feels he can't for all sorts of different reasons. So whenever I come here, I always pay a visit to that particular grave for him. I haven't heard from him for a while, and I hope he's still out there, particularly after the last few years that we've had. But it's an intriguing story, What does it mean? You tell me. I don't know. I guess it links to that feeling that we all have when we visit these places. We often hear people describe the atmosphere in High Wood or Mametz Wood or one of the woods around Ypres. Is it because we know what happened there? Is it our minds racing over time and imagining things? Who knows? I think for any of us that have walked this ground, there is a presence in some way. We feel something here, and we feel a connection to the stories of the men buried in places like this. These vast cemeteries in the locations behind the lines are such an important part of our understanding of the Great War, because these are all known soldiers, as we said earlier. We know who they are, we know their stories, we know their background, we know what happened to them, and through them we can see the war in a kind of microcosm, in the different aspects of it, how it affected communities, how it affected families, how children grew up without fathers, wives were widows, mothers left without their favourite son or their only son. This week we've not been in the trenches, we've not been on the battlefield, we've been behind the lines. But there's so much for us to understand and take away from places like this, because they too are part of the old front line. You've been listening to an episode of The Old Front Line with me, military historian Paul Reed. You can follow me on Twitter at Somcorps. You can follow the podcast at Old Frontline Pod. Check out the website at oldfrontline.co.uk, where you'll find lots of podcast extras and photographs and links to books that are mentioned in the podcast. And if you feel like supporting us, you can go to our Patreon page, patreon.com/oldfrontline, or support us on Buy Me a Coffee at buymeacoffee.com/oldfrontline. Links to all of these are on our website. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again soon.